So in this section, and this is the final section of what we're going to be covering today, because you're probably already kind of a little tired of hearing all these new things and a little bit worn out. It's not that you've learned everything you needed to know. You don't. We would actually have to have a class that would last about 4 or 5 days, but they won't let us do that. We're lucky just to get you for 1 day. So we try to put the highlights in here. We tell you the fact that we do have videos, we do have documentation, and we do have open labs. And those are the options that you can use to get some additional information. So with that said, the last thing we want to talk about right now is metadata. You heard Doug talk a little bit about metadata and how he was going to spend last summer going through and modifying some of his libraries to put metadata in those libraries. Well, as it turned out, he got moved over the summer. He got moved over to West Orange, so I'm not sure if any of that happened. But we actually encountered several schools who have come back to us and said, we didn't believe that metadata was so important until we start looking at all the files we had. This whole problem of metadata and the reason for using the metadata came out of people storing libraries that had folders within folders within folders within folders within folders down to multiple levels, and then they would put files in. The next person would come along and they didn't remember where to put the file, so they would create a new folder somewhere else in the tree, and now you'd have 2 files out there that are supposed to represent the same thing, and they're in 2 totally different locations. Some people find location A, some people find location B, and you start updating different sources. No source is the final say of what's supposed to be in that document. You got some changes in each of them. And even if you do manage to find out that you've got duplicates, then the question is, how do you get everything back into one document? How do you merge all those changes that people may have made? And this is a common problem across the board. It's not just schools, it's the district departments here. We've also have another problem that's related to folders within folders, and that's that the URL becomes too long. And you cannot just simply type in the URL and get to it. Yes, you can navigate one folder at a time to get to the file, but if you tried to take the URL of that particular location, that file, and put it into the address bar at the top of the screen, it would not work. And the reason it doesn't work is because there's a limit to the total number of characters that a URL can have. So we found many cases where they wanted to be so descriptive in their folder names and so descriptive in their file names that they would literally run out of characters. And when they tried to put the URL address in, they would capture it. When that file was open, they would capture the address, and they would try to stick it into a Word doc or an email and send it to someone else. And when they tried to open it, it wouldn't open because it would truncate some of those characters off because it wouldn't know how to handle it. So this problem is actually multifold. It's a couple of things. It's the fact that people get confused. It's the fact that sometimes the URL gets too long. So metadata is actually something that Microsoft has been trying to promote with SharePoint since SharePoint first came out. It's been an uphill process, and part of the problem, I think, is the fact that everyone who's used to using computers learned how to use computers back in the day when they said, think of your hard drive as a file cabinet. And inside your file cabinet, you have file folders. And inside those file folders, you may have documents. Or you may have other file folders that have documents. Or maybe they have file folders that have documents. And they defined this paradigm, which was very successful at the time, but very poor now that people have thousands and thousands of documents in a library. So Microsoft is really trying to push, and I've been 100% in agreement with this, push metadata. In effect, you have no folders. Everything is just in one large list. But what you do have is additional columns that go about defining that information. Now, once you have that additional set of columns, you can do things with it. For instance, you can format a page and you can retrieve data very selectively and format it on the page very selectively based upon what you're pulling from that library. Now, the reason I have the page up here right now, this is our newsletter archive. And in our newsletter archive, we have all of our newsletters going back to the original 2009 October issue. It was when I first started doing them. Now, from our library, we have not only all of the final versions, because what you're seeing here, all these links are to PDF files, because I don't want people to actually have to worry about whether they have Microsoft Publisher, because that's what I use to create the newsletter. I don't expect them to have Publisher on their desktop. So if I just put the source file up there, they wouldn't be able to open it. So every time I save a newsletter, I save it as a PDF. And those are the links that you actually see on this page. I don't know if I hover over it. Yeah, they're pretty long. You can't see it at the bottom, but kind of truncates it off. But they are all PDFs of what's being displayed. But I also want to keep the source file for all these documents very close. I don't want to store the source file one place and the PDF somewhere else. And then if I have to go back and look at one of the old newsletters to either make a correction or to retrieve something that I want to use somewhere else, I don't want to have to try to hunt, where did I save that source file? Or how do I get it out of the PDF? So I want to save everything in one place. Well, one way of doing it is, of course, to have multiple folders. And I could have folders sitting out there that would represent all the source files, or maybe within that file of that folder called source files, I would have a folder for every year. So I would have a year 2009, 2010, 2011, just to organize all those files. Could do that. And then the final documents could be in another file folder, which had file folders within it for the years. And that's not too bad. That's only 2 layers, 2 levels. But trust me, there are departments out there that have many more than 2 levels. But even that I didn't like. So I wanted to find a way that I could put them all together in one library. And by the way, what you're seeing on this page, even though it's split out by year, and I'm only displaying the PDFs and not the source files, this is done with a single web part. And I'll explain that after I show you the library, which is another benefit of doing it this way. It makes things very easy to maintain. So if I go to Site Actions and View Site Content and take a look at what this library actually looks like. In this library, I'll open a couple of these. You can see it is separated by year, but this is just a view definition. You can take any column that you have in that particular library, and you can add any number of columns to a library. It's not just the name of the document, the date it was created, the date it was modified. You can add any number of columns you want, and I'll show you that also in a moment. But in defining the view, I said I wanted to group the files by year. And that's why you see the break, and that's why initially they were collapsed, so that you saw only the years listed, and then the numbers next to each one was the number of files in that year. And they're all 24s, except for back in 2010 I missed 1 month, and I started in 2009. But if you look at all of these, all the data that goes across has some meaning. The first column is just an icon. It just tells you the type of file. You can tell a PDF, and the other one that has a little green P in the square in the upper left, that's a publisher file. So there's 2 copies of every file. Then I have a name and a title. Now, anytime you have a document library, you have both a name and a title. The name of the file is the physical name of the document itself. So if you looked on your hard disk and you looked at all the files on your hard disk, name is what is going to be the same as those physical file names. So that's going to be okay for some things, and maybe that's all you care about if your names are going to be descriptive enough. But maybe you want to go and you want to use title. And actually I had these backwards. Name was the third one, title is the second one. And you can make title anything you want. You can even have it blank. By default, when you use the content query web part to be able to display the contents of a library, you tell it whether you want to use name, title, or even something else. What I've decided to do for any type of newsletter is the name is generally the file name from the original source. The title is what I want the user to see. And that can be shorter or longer than what the original name is. It can even be the same. Now you see that in the one case, that very first one, there is no title because that particular document I never display anywhere. It's a Word document. It never gets displayed. So I really don't care about title. The others generally, as you go through, will have both a name and a title. Modified and modified by, I'm displaying that in my list just because I wanted to see it, but do I really need it? Probably not. But I added two things that you don't normally see in a library. Those two columns are category and year. Now, when you decide you want to add another column, a piece of metadata, you come up to the library ribbon, and under settings, you want to go to library settings. And as the second section, there are it's the list of columns that is currently in the library. And you'll start off with just basically title, created by, modified by, checked out to. But I wanted to add category, and I clicked the create column option that's underneath the existing column names. And what that allows me to do is add a column to this particular library, basically add metadata. Now, I'm not going to go through this one. You can see that you have a lot of different options here. I'm not going to create another column for this particular list, but you can see you can have everything from a single line of text, multiple lines of text, choice, which is a drop-down, essentially a way of selecting from different predefined values, a number, currency, date and time, lookup, which comes from another list within SharePoint, a yes/no checkbox, which I pretty much never use, person or group. These are people that have to be in Active Directory. So like if you're doing something with tasks and you're assigning tasks to a project, you would probably use this to define who it's being assigned to as far as the field type. Hyperlinks or pictures, it's a tricky field to work with because one of the things that you're going to have to define when you work with hyperlinks or pictures is, are you working with the picture or the hyperlink of the picture? When you're entering the data, you're working with the hyperlink. When you're displaying it, you're displaying the picture. So sometimes you need to have two different views depending on whether you want to use that view for display purposes or that view for editing. Calculated columns, which this month's newsletter that's going to go out on Monday, this coming Monday, is going to have a 4-page article that gives you an introduction to calculated columns and external data, which is data that you can pull from another source like SQL Server or Oracle or anywhere else. So you have a lot of different options for defining your columns. Most of your columns are going to be single line of text, with the next most popular probably being date and time. For each one, depending on what you select, you will have a series of settings that define that type of data. So if it's a single line of text, one of the things it's going to ask you is a description. Well, almost all the column types have descriptions. But you also can specify, is this a required column? You know, we mentioned, or Doug mentioned, that on some of the forms that he has fields that are absolutely required because otherwise people wouldn't fill them in. Well, you would check here, yes, that this column contains information, and yes, you want to enforce, well, maybe you don't want to enforce unique values. Depends on what you're doing. But yes, you do want to contain information. That's the required column. Anything that has that first yes is required. Then depending upon what it is that you're putting in it, maybe it's unique, maybe it's not. Maximum number of characters, 255. That is the absolute maximum for a single line of text. Actually, interestingly enough, I think it's also the max for a multiple line of text. But you can have something smaller. Does it save a lot of space? Depends on how much data you have. For most things that are in SharePoint, you don't have huge numbers of records. You don't have millions and billions of records. So it's not going to save huge amounts. But if you're only going to be storing like a zip code, and even with the +4, you need 10 characters, let's say. Why keep 255 characters where most of them are blank? Where 245 are blank. So you might want to use the maximum number of characters for some things. It prevents people from typing in incorrect information from the standpoint of putting in a zip code that has 11 characters, 12 characters. Does it absolutely prevent them putting in something wrong? No. They could put in an 8-character zip code. What does that mean? They skip something somewhere, but who knows where. So it's not a perfect way of validating your data, but you can use it to maximize the number of characters. Should it have a default value? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes the best default value is blank. Don't worry about it. And you want to add it to the default view, I always recommend that you select that. And there's a thing called column validation. That's going to be probably in next month's newsletter as far as going through and explaining how that works and what you might use it for. For today, don't worry about it. So basically I did that same thing. I'm going to cancel this and I'm going to show you the other one. I'm going to show you category. When category was filled out, it was a single line of text, and it could have a description, which I didn't put anything in. And as far as SharePoint is concerned, that's all it really needs to know. It doesn't need anything else. So there are some other options that when I first created it, like I told it that the default was going to be blank and so forth. But once you create it, you can't go back and change those. You can't go back and change the length of a field to something that's already been created. You can't go back and change the default value once something has already been created. So that's why you don't see all those other options. Same thing with the other column. I'm going to cancel this one. The other column was year. Not a lot there that you can see after it was already created. But if you look at the actual view, and I'm going to cheat by going down to the view this way. When you look at the actual view and you look at some of these other columns, we'll go down to 2009, you see that the category is either newsletter or source. It's arbitrary choice. I chose to use those. But I'm going to tell you right now that whatever you put in, whatever you use, it is going to compare. When you try to do any type of filtering, it will look at the letters that you use and do a match. Case does not matter when you do filtering. But it will look at the newsletter, and if you type in newsletter one place and newsletters in another place, those are two different values as far as SharePoint's concerned. Same thing if I spell newsletter with one T instead of two T's, it's going to be two different values. So one of the other examples I'm going to show in a second is the extracurricular activities. We've had a lot of problems with people not knowing how to type the name of their school, and as a result they have data all over the place. And I don't know if I'll be able to find a quick example of that, but spelling does count, case does not. And then the other column, the year, 2009, 2010, hopefully people don't get that one too messed up. But when I define the view, I can do a grouping within the view so that it keeps all the 2009 together. So you see I've got every file I need. I got my source file as well as the one I'm going to be presenting, which is the PDF. They're in one library. They're right next to each other because it's alphabetical. How can you lose anything this way? Whereas if you start having folders within folders within folders, it gets to be easier to lose things. The other thing that we did for newsletters, just because we're talking about this newsletter folder, is that there's a very special category at the top. That special category is no category. It's left blank. And it also has the unique name for the file of current newsletter. Now we use that. If you saw it on your page and you have the same thing on the page that is on your site, it displays the current copy of a newsletter. Now the trick to this is, and sometimes people get it, sometimes people don't, but every month when I create a new newsletter, I upload it twice, the PDF. I upload it once with the correct name, with the year and the date, just like you see at the bottom there for 2009 SharePoint _V1N1, which would have been volume 1, number 1. So it would have that identifier so I know exactly where it belongs. But I'd upload a second copy called current newsletter every month. And what it will do is it will replace the version that's out there currently. Now the key and the advantage to that is if I have another page that's referencing that newsletter to display it, and it's displayed with a page viewer, by the way. And if you go back and look at the way your site's built, and you'll be able to edit the page and look at how it's built, the page viewer actually is looking for a very specific file. And as long as all you're doing is replacing that file with another file with exactly the same name, okay, not title, name, has to be exactly the same, because that's how it refers to things internally. As long as you're replacing it with exactly the same name, the next time when someone opens that page and sees the page viewer, they'll get the new newsletter. Now, what that means is you never have to edit the page again. And that's good and bad. Because right now, the people that own the portal, public relations, want to go through and delete all pages that haven't been edited in the last 2 years. I have pages that have not been edited in the last 2 years because I don't need to. because I do this little trick and all I have to do is upload the new file. So I don't know how that's going to come out. But the same thing occurs actually in a lot of other places. For instance, originally when they first start doing the school sites, there was a problem with putting up the current menu, because every month there would be a new menu for that month. And originally what they were doing is they were putting out a new menu with a new file name, and they would say things like 2008 January, 2008 February, 2008 March. And of course the school's never updated, because when do you have time to do all that? So this is actually back when we first discovered that we could do this, and we developed this technique and we started using it in many places. And we said, well, what if we just had the file very generically called menu or school menu? And every month, instead of putting it up as another file, a second file, third file, fourth file, with a new name, let's just upload a version of that file that's just called school menu, and replace the one that was there before, and tell all the schools to link to that one. That way, once they've done that, they never have to touch it again. They put out a new menu, they publish that new menu, it's replacing the old one. They don't do a thing. The schools and the kids see the new menu automatically. Advantage of metadata as opposed to just file names. So we start doing that in a lot of different places, and then we start expanding the metadata. So this example here is just one example. In the newsletter, you can go back and you can look at the way the newsletter page was built and the library that went with it. There's a couple of files in it, not all of them, for the newsletters, but you can see basically how we went about building it. But I also mentioned this other site, and I want to show you a little bit of the other site, because again, it's a good example of metadata. This site is for what they called the settlement agreement. Of course, when they wanted to publish this out to outward-facing pages and call it settlement agreement, I said to the people that were involved, are you crazy? The public's not going to have a clue what you mean by that. I said, what is this really? This is really extracurricular activities. Why not call the page extracurricular activities? I don't care what you call this internally, but again, you got to be somewhat reasonable in terms of what the outside people are going to look at. And what they want to be able to do with this is keep track of all the extracurricular activities at middle and high schools. Elementaries are not required to do this at this point. So middle and high schools have to put in this information, and it includes what the activity is, who the principal is, who the coach is, when are tryouts, what times are the tryouts, where are the tryouts, basically some of these other columns that go across the top. Let me get rid of this because I wanted to have it start with everything. So if I start by looking at this particular library, and actually if I just, can I go back up to just the library itself? I'll go to view all site content. You can see that this particular library has 2,356 rows. So when you go and you open that particular library and you're trying to find information about your school, do you really want to hunt through 2,300 and whatever it was rows of data to find all the rows for your school? Now, yes, you can sort things. So you can come back up and you can say, I want to be able to sort by school name, and you can see by default I am sorting by school name already. But what if your school name is Ocoee Middle? Are you going to be able to scroll down and keep scrolling down? Well, let's just use the scroll bar instead. It'll be a little bit faster. Okay, I scrolled down 250 because we only display 250 at a time, and I'm only down to C, Colonial High School. Now there's a little where you see at the bottom where it says 1-250. That's how I know I've got 250 on this page. We don't display all 2,000 because primarily the more lines you display, the longer it takes for that page to come back, because SharePoint has to actually format that page. It builds it on the fly. The page doesn't pre-exist. So the more lines you have, the longer it takes and the longer the delay is to display that page. We arbitrarily chose 250. Definitely don't want to do 2,000. So how do you get to Ocoee? Well, I could keep hitting that arrow at the bottom to keep going to the next page, and the next page, and the next page, and the next page, and hope you're not one of the schools at the very end of the list. But an easier way of doing it, let me go back up to the top, is to use the metadata and say that, okay, I know I want to see only my school. School name happens to be one of the fields. So I'm going to come down and I'm going to select my school. And it does this, it builds this list for you automatically. Once the data is in, SharePoint looks at all the rows of data and looks for all the unique values and displays them. As a result, if you don't spell things exactly the same way every single time, you're going to get duplicate entries. For instance, look at the very bottom. You have Timber Creek and Timber Creek High School. How much you want to bet that's really the same school? Okay? And that's because they weren't consistent. And there are worse cases than that. I'm not going to worry about trying to find them right now, but let's take Ocoee Middle School. So now when I scroll down, I have a much smaller list. In fact, I see the entire list. There are no arrows at the bottom to go to another page. Now, if I chose a high school, it could be a little bit longer. I don't know if we have any high schools that really go to 2 pages, but there might be. And I can essentially go through this list and probably find what I want. But I could also go to any of the other columns of metadata. One of the other pieces of information is who's the sponsor coach. And instead of searching through and trying to find who I want, let's say I just come down here and let's select Adam Walton. I click on him, and apparently Adam's responsible for 2 different activities. He's got the Beta Club induction and Beta Club officer election, which was defined as 2 separate organizations, 2 clubs. I don't know if that's right or wrong. Let's say it's right. I don't really care for what I do. My point is this. I can find things very quickly with metadata. Think of this also in terms of any library where you have information on different types of documents. If you think of what you used to have in terms of folders within folders within folders within folders, and instead of going down that hierarchy of folders, make those folders column headers and values within those columns. So where I might have had before a folder that was organization or team, now it's a piece of metadata. Instead of having school as a folder, now it's a piece of metadata. Instead of having the principal as a folder, now it's a piece of metadata. So all those things that you might have had to search for by before, when you wanted to find information in that file cabinet, you make it as metadata across the top, and then you can very quickly search 2,000 records, just a couple of clicks, I'm down to 2. That's the power of metadata. And we're doing this actually with a couple of other internal departments at the district here, where they literally had thousands and thousands of files, and they lost track of where everything is. And it took us, I've been trying with this one guy, about 5 years to get him away from his folders and get him to use metadata. And finally this year he saw the light, and he's converted everything to metadata. And not only has he converted his stuff to metadata, he's become an evangelist, telling other people you got to use metadata because now you can find things. It does make your life a whole lot easier to have metadata to find things. So the easiest way I can explain the metadata to someone is where you had folders before, those become your headers and the values within the headers. And if you have detailed questions, come to one of our open labs and we'll work with you to get it set up.
You got to explain why he came in and said, this is not working anymore.
Because he had such long file names, he couldn't open anything anymore.
Because it wasn't just file names. They had folders with long file names, and inside that, they had folders with long file names, and inside that, documents with descriptive file names. So that just adds to the URL. That's why if you only have it at the top level, one document library with no folders, it's just the name of the document.
And you can do searches. I mean, this doesn't have really large data, but if you have a single line of text, you can do a contained search. There are other ways that you can search within to make it a little bit easier to find things. So metadata is really the way to go, not folders within folders. And you can get to the point where you have absolutely no folders at all or minimal folders. Over the last 2-3 years, we've been working with the grants department here within the district, and we've been taking them paperless. Now, grants, they have huge file cabinets. They have a room that's the size of a small conference room filled with file cabinets, or at least they used to, because they had to keep all the different documents and all the grants. And not only did they keep it, other departments had to keep copies as well. At this point, everything is electronic. They don't keep the paper at all anymore. And as a result, they now have a conference room again instead of being a storage room. So I think it's this spring will be the 3-year anniversary. And at that point, all the remaining paper gets moved out because they have a 3-year cycle that they have to keep things for. And we're having a little bit of a celebration, I've been told, once everything gets moved out.
We are?
Yes, we are. I've already been told. Another one of the ice cream and soda parties like we did the last time when we first started this, because they're so thrilled with the way it's made their lives much easier. They can find things. So that's basically the way this stuff works. Now, how did this data get into this list? The data got into the list. I'm going to open up new document instead of opening up an existing one. Now this one happened to be an InfoPath form, but I can do similar things with Word documents or with a Excel spreadsheet. Not everybody needs necessarily a InfoPath file. I don't remember all the details why we chose InfoPath initially, but when we first created it, we created it as an InfoPath file, and it opened on my other screen. Let me drag it over. That's the form they fill in. And every time they fill in that form and hit the submit button, a new record goes into that list.
We really need to change that form from a application form to a web form, because I think you can do it. I don't think it's right.
Probably, but this was one of the very first ones that was done.
Yeah, we can create.
This goes way back. This is when we were first playing with the stuff.
You know, it's funny because you asked about, like, you pulled up ours and you said Beta Club,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if you notice, no place on there doesn't give you the name of the event.
No.
It just says the name of the club.
Right.
So if there's two separate things for one club, that's why it gets two separate names.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had a thing for name of club and then event, then you could find it easier to separate out.
Yeah. But the point is, this is what we were told to do. We didn't,
I know.
and if yeah, basically that's what it was driving it.
Yes, I know.
They had a legal requirement to fulfill, and they wanted to be able to collect certain pieces of information and have it available to display to the public, and this fit the needs. And rather than have them directly enter the data into the spreadsheet itself or directly into the list, we created this form. Now, would we do it differently today? Probably. We've learned a lot more since then. We've created a lot of other forms since then. This one I could easily, if nothing changed, I could create this one in Word, which I didn't know how to do back then. So we all learn over time. Just we're learning just like you're learning. So you come up with different techniques and different ways of doing things. This didn't even have any lookups. This, really we should have lookups.
Which you should, if you know who I'm submitting, who I am, you should know what school I'm submitting for.
Right.
Yeah.
And we should be able to spell the school right.
Right.
But it just made
what
me
we
think
did
differently. Is that it would be the drop down. The school would be a drop down.
Mm-hmm.
The school wouldn't be a name. It would be powered by a list that we already have, that we maintain,
Right.
and they would only choose.
Well, we could have, and what we're doing now in some of the more recent ones is we pull a table of all the schools and the principals, along with some additional information, whatever we think we need, every night. And we could reference that particular database file. It's a SQL database file. And when they select the school, then anything that we need to bring along with it, we could specify, and this goes into far more depth than you need right now today. But you can specify what other fields you want to bring along, and if principal name is one of the other fields, you tell it to bring it along. That means you can't edit it here, but why would you want to? Okay, so you would just bring along the other information that you needed. Now, of course, things like contact name, that would have to be filled in probably manually, name of the club or organization. Most of those are still manual type things, but after a certain point, you start to see patterns, and you want to say, instead of having the person just do it free form, is there a way that we can do it as a drop-down list? For instance, even with the name of club, organization, or team. If we had some consistency across all the schools, like even if they said football the same way, but we have boys football, JV football, and it just all over the place. Then in theory, when I use the metadata, instead of selecting school first, I could select the name of the club. I could select football and see every school that has a football team and who the coach is by just looking at my list using the metadata. It's almost like a database from that extent.
of makes me remember and put some thought into if I'm going to create metadata, what my column titles should be.
Right.
So, like in that case, I need one for event and one for club name,
Mhm.
so I can find it easier later on.
And sometimes you
Here.
wind up creating things one way, and then over time you kind of change things. It depends on the priority. Sometimes things never get changed, but you also learn from one to another, so that the next time you build another form, you don't quite do it the same way. You learn from those things. So
Here would be a big thing for me on this one, because then you can filter out all the old stuff, or you can
Right.
remove easily the old stuff.
right, that has been a problem because
They don't go back and clean the.
Yes, I had to do that at the start of the year because I got the notice that I had not posted anything for the year because they were still seeing Sharon Gabriel, the old principal.
Mhm.
Nothing under the new.
that's one way you can determine it.
Right.
Another way you can determine it is the tryout dates.
Mhm.
If they put tryout dates in, and sometimes they'll put in something very, strange, like the first Monday of November. Okay, that doesn't tell me anything. That doesn't tell me year. But if they had a specific date, then I know if it's an old record or a new record. So yeah, there are things we would do different. No question. No question. But the point is, this is the way you start thinking about metadata, and then as you start using it, you refine your methods so that it makes it very easy to find things. And the problem that we had that really drives the date issue is, how do you get rid of the old stuff? How do you know what's new, what's old? So that's when you go back and you look at your metadata. How can we do that differently? Maybe it's just adding another field. And from this point forward, we take everything that's currently in there and we call it this year's data, because we don't know. But from this point forward, we'll have a year that goes along with every record, so that in future years we can just eliminate the old data.
So if somebody, like you build a collaboration site for your collaboration tool, your PLC tool, you're creating a document on there, and you've set in one of your views, you've created a column that's required.
Mhm.
When they create that document, does it prompt them somewhere to fill in that value for that column?
You see those little asterisks at the end of the right? Those are required columns.
No, but I'm talking about, okay, so
If you try to submit without saving anything to those columns, it does tell you.
Okay. No, I'm thinking, I'm not creating a form.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's say they're doing their PLC document, whatever that is.
Okay.
Like a lesson plan. But one of the metadata I have in my view for a column is, what semester was it?
Mm-hmm.
Just to say, and I make that a required column in the view,
Right.
a required value in that column.
Right.
Where does it prompt them to fill in that value?
When you try to save it,
Okay.
it won't save.
Okay.
Now, depending on where you allow it to fail, determines how good the error message is. In this case, with the InfoPath form, I can tell them specifically which columns they missed. If it's just the list itself, I'm not sure if it just tells you that you're missing required fields or if it tells you the specific column. I generally try to keep things inside the forms when I use forms.
InfoPath usually will give you the dotted lines around a box that's required if it's missing.
Right. I'm just thinking though, because they're not going to be using the form per se.
Yeah, but the
It's like a
library,
Word
if
document.
you're creating a custom list where they're filling out the custom list, they're like that copy request form. There's required stuff in there. So you have, like, the teacher's name is required. So if they don't put that information in there,
Right. No,
that's not a form. That's not an InfoPath
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand that part. But let's say going back to your SharePoint shots list.
Mm-hmm.
If, let's say you have that category column, which is newsletter resource.
Mhm.
Let's say you made that a required column.
Right.
Okay?
Now you'd have to be careful with that, because usually when the SharePoint that category column it controls something. It's either controlling a content query web part. So, for instance, say somebody needs to be in it, so it views, it shows. So sometimes it'll have source, and sometimes it will say like newsletter. Newsletter would show in the archived web part, which is a content query, querying a library, querying a particular column for a particular word, that newsletter. So if you require something in it, sometimes blank is a fair answer. Sometimes you might not want it to be effective.
Right.
So blank is okay with something like that.
But let's just say, perchance, everything you're going to put in this document.
Then you want to drop down.
Is,
Then you
but
wanna drop.
where do they put that information in? Is my question.
When you define the
Find
column.
the column. it tells you, you give the options, is it gonna be a text file, is it gonna be a choice column, a yes or no?
I don't think I'm making myself very clear. Like, for instance, I got this right here, so I say new document,
Uh-huh.
right, I change Word document, okay? Whatever. Alright, so, I'm doing this, I'm starting it, but let's say in the view, if I went to that document library, in the view, the actual list of documents there, I've created a column that's required. Where is it that where does that value?
When they do that document right there?
Yes.
When it uploads.
Yeah.
When you try to
When
save
you
that
upload a
record.
document, when you upload a document, there's information that is required to the library. When you upload that document, it's going to tell you, hey, I need this information. Please include it.
I see. Okay. That was my call. Okay. Yeah. The metadata is going to ask for that.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. But, I mean, you can control, like, that wouldn't be the way I would do it. If I would change the way the library runs and give them, if there's a document that you want them to fill out, I would make it a custom list. I wouldn't make it a Word
No,
document.
right.
But anytime you upload, say you're uploading a picture, right, and you want metadata for that picture. When the picture was taken, who the maybe it was who the picture, who took the picture. So you can have that information. So when you upload a picture to an image library, it's going to give you a bunch of predetermined information that is going to be needed. Is this stuff required? No. But can you make it required? Yes.
Let me just run through this one. This is the sample data on the School of Rock. I'm going to add another column, and so I'm going to say create column, and I'm going to say required field as the name, even though it's a weird name, just so you know what it is. It'll be a single line of text. I'm going to say that it is required. I'm not going to enforce unique values and no default or anything, and click OK. Now it's not going to affect anything that's currently there. The existing data is not affected by a change in that new column that was being added. However, what?
But if someone edits the document that is there and it's required field, they're going to have to put something in it.
That's correct. So now when I look at the data, you see there's a required field option down here on the off to the end, but there's nothing in it for any of them currently. So I want to go in and I want to add another record at this point. So I want to say add document. And basically for this particular library, adding document means uploading a file. So I'm just going to browse for something real quick, just grab something, doesn't really matter what. I'm going to just upload an image. And it's going to be in the root folder because I don't have any subfolders. And since I uploaded a single document, this is what you would get normally if you're not using InfoPath for forms. You would get a very generic form like this where the user can enter the data. You see that the first one, name, is required, but that's the name of the file, so okay, you already know that. That's a given. And let's say we put in for title, I'm just going to put in sample. Category was test, and year was 2014, and I don't put in required field, even though it tells me that it's a required field because it has an asterisk. And I try to click on save. That's what happens. Does that kind of answer your question?
Almost. Because
Almost?
that's when uploading files.
Right.
But that's not with actually going here and creating a file in SharePoint itself.
But you have to create the columns first.
Right, so that's what I'm doing right now.
Yep.
So, and I'm saying, this is just a required column.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So now when you start, go ahead and create.
Go back here.
Yep. No.
And I'm going to create a new document.
New document.
Aha. So when I created it, that's what it had.
But you get essentially the same screen.
Okay. Yes. Excellent.
Okay? Other questions? I think once you start playing with metadata, you're going to start liking it, and you're going to start thinking of more ways that you can classify the information that you're storing in the libraries, and that will help you find things. It will also help you organize views of your data. And for instance, there's one department I call them the Indicator 11 department. I don't know what their real name is, but they have this one library out there, this one list that has, is it speech and language? Yeah, they've got about 24 columns, and they probably have about 36 different views because of different things that they want to see in different ways. You can have as many views as you want. There's no limit. And what they've done with the views is different subsets, different cuts of the data. Rather than look at all the records, they have like 7,000 records. They don't want to see them all. No one wants to see them all. So all these views represent different slices of the data.
Just like when I was talking to you before about if the PLCs, you wanted one library for each PLC to upload stuff to. Why not have one library called PLCs, and you have a column with that gives them the ability to select which PLC that is. So if you're a principal, you go to one location where the PLC is, you see all the PLCs, and then if you wanted to look for a specific one, you just filter with the metadata across the column from the top. So you can look at the top, the date, the year, the PLC that it's referenced to. I don't know how you break down your PLCs, so if it's a department thing or a grade thing or whatever, I don't know.
Well, out at the school, the tech tickets are essentially the same thing. They can search the tech tickets similar with the metadata. So try playing with it a little bit first is what I recommend. When you have questions or you're not sure and you want to try to do something you're not exactly sure how to do it,
Email Antonovich.
which I'll just forward to Mike Adani.
Right, and then I'll do it a ton of it.
It just goes around. But the ideal thing is come to Open Lab, and we'll sit down with you and we'll get it straightened out so that it works the way you want it. Okay? This is, like I said from the very beginning of today, a lot of this is to introduce topics, to get you to think about how you could use these things.